Just a few moments ago, in the State Senate today, we continued a process that will set voting rights in this Commonwealth back decades and decades and decades. Extremely disappointed in the manner in which we conducted a discussion in that chamber, what we believe was not an issue of voter ID, but rather, as my colleagues discussed, an issue of voter repression. Keeping folks having the ability to exercise their fundamental right to vote in this Commonwealth. Very disappointed that that's where we are today. Senate Democrats put up a very valiant effort to try to make a horrible bill a little better. We offered 24 different amendments that addressed a variety of issues to make certain that the process of voting in this Commonwealth was going to be one that made it accessible for people to be able to do without placing barriers before them. And we lost on those issues. And ultimately the bill passed the Senate barely by a constitutional margin of 26 to 23. We're very disappointed that that's where we're at today. I'm joined here by a number of our colleagues who wanted to express their concern about this course of action as it moves forward in the process, and to talk a little bit about some of the issues that, quite frankly, still bother them and still resonate in their stomachs, how the disgusting feeling it is that we're moving down this path with respect to this legislation. Our first speaker is going to be Senator Anthony Williams, the chairman of our State Government Committee, and he'd like to offer a few remarks as well.
The benefit of this press conference, I'm sure many of you heard the comments that were made, so I won't repeat them, but just so you'll know, there are next steps. The bill that is in search of a problem, the cost to the Commonwealth and the debt-ridden budget process, a lack of an independent fiscal note, but most importantly, states which have undertaken this are now in a position where they're overturning it. Our next steps will be to find probably a legal remedy. Unfortunately, because the bill is going to move forward, apparently in a fast-track kind of process, our next recourse is to go to the courts. So on behalf of the Senate Democrats, I am announcing that we will be looking for legal counsel, and as we require that, we will be questioning a number of the items that are glaring holes of a constitutional nature when it comes to this piece of legislation. That's the only thing I need to add. My hope is that we won't have to end up in the courts, and that rational minds will prevail when it gets to the House. The governor will discover that a large portion of the constituents across Pennsylvania do not want to lose their right to vote, but the reality is, if that does not happen, we will find ourselves in a court someplace in Pennsylvania to prevent this law from taking place and taking effect, certainly in this cycle. Thank you.
Okay, good. It has become abundantly clear with a great level of specificity exactly where this administration has placed itself with respect to working people and low-income people across the Commonwealth. Finally, maybe the last cut of 1,000 cuts so far in the 15 months or so of this administration is the suppression of the vote. We know that, I believe there are 20 different states who are working on voter suppression measures in various different forms, all of them with Republican governors. And they're moving them forward. One of them was blocked yesterday in Wisconsin by a good-thinking judge who clearly stated without any hesitation that one of the key aspects of the provision there, which is consistent here, is that in many respects this is a poll tax. You're placing a poll tax. Well, we got rid of those, at least at the federal level, I believe 50 or 60 or so years ago. But this administration is through ending health care services, through throwing people out of the food stamp program, through cutting education spending by over $1 billion, by raising tuition increases for kids going to college, by having a no job creation program, and now with the issue of the vote, clearly is not focused on the interests of where a majority of Pennsylvania citizens are. They're going in a completely different direction. So I support Senator Williams and our entire caucus's move to go to courts. If that's where we've got to go to stop this thing from happening, that's where we need to go. But this administration is crafted a very clear picture of who it's for and who it's not for. All these cuts and ending the rights of individuals, and at the same time providing almost $400 million in tax breaks for the largest corporations in the Commonwealth with no commitment to put people to work. The voter suppression bill that we just voted today is the final cut that this administration is taking on people who want to move this state forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Photography was invented about 170 years ago. We have, as a Commonwealth, have survived for 170 years without a photo ID requirement at the polls. In that time, and we asked today repeatedly, I asked, Senator Williams asked, others asked, tell me, how many cases of voter impersonation are there? How many have there been in the last decade? How many have there been as far back as you can remember? Can you name a case of voter impersonation that was either prosecuted, even if it was unsuccessfully prosecuted, even an accusation that someone tried to impersonate another voter at a poll in Pennsylvania? And we heard that there was not a single case in Pennsylvania of that. 170 years of photography, we've survived, and the trend lines are pretty flat. Zero across the board is a pretty flat trend line. So whenever someone tells you this is about preventing fraud, I'm just going to repeat what I said today very briefly. There is only one kind of fraud this protects against, which is voter impersonation, and there are no cases of voter impersonation in Pennsylvania. Then why? Why are we doing this? We are told by our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. The governor was very involved in lobbying for this. Leadership was very involved in pressuring members to support this who were reluctant to support this. Why? To solve a problem that doesn't exist. If it's not what Vince calls voter suppression, what I call election rigging. Keep in mind, this is a leadership and administration that has repeatedly tried to rig elections. This is not the only thing. There was the Electoral College thing, which ultimately did not run yet. There was the gerrymandering, which even a bipartisan Supreme Court in Pennsylvania said had gone too far. And then we have voter ID. There is clearly a desire to use a temporary hold on power to permanently rig future elections. Because you know what? It's not as fun to lose elections as it is to win them. And so they are using their power, for the first time in 200 years, by the way, that a party has not resisted the temptation to do this, to try to rig future elections for their own benefits. As Senator, you said, Wisconsin, the court struck this down. And I believe the courts here will strike this down as well. As lawyers here know, there's a balancing test that's employed. The benefit, the state's interest versus the collateral damage to the fundamental right to vote. Here, the state has no interest in preventing a crime that there's no evidence ever occurs, and it has a tremendous detriment of disenfranchising 700,000 people. I would conclude with just saying that it's ironic, as I said on the floor, that we did not have to show our IDs today when we voted for this suppression bill, for this vote rigging bill. Okay, but yet we will require Pennsylvanians, old, handicapped, veterans, to jump through hoop after hoop, spend dollar after dollar to try to get the right to vote that should be guaranteed to all of us. So we will see you in the courts, where I think this will ultimately be decided.
Thank you. I'm actually very proud to stand here with my Democratic colleagues to comment on this matter, but also disappointed that I'd even have to. You know, I said during the redistricting issue, at what point do we trust our ideas to the people of Pennsylvania? At what point do we trust our ideas to the will and the judgment of all Pennsylvanians? And to Dalen's point, to Senator Leach's point, apparently there are some people who are holding office in this building that don't trust the judgment of the people on their ideas and instead decide to manipulate the process and exercise some political control. My comments inside the chamber were something like this. It's not only an issue of disenfranchisement, but it also just essentially builds on the cynicism in terms of what people believe about what motivates our public policy and our governance in this building. And again, echoing the comments of my colleagues, there are 370,000 seniors who don't have any form of a photo ID. So there are disproportionate effects of this policy and of this bill on populations of Pennsylvanians who simply want to exercise the most fundamental right of our democracy. It's really disconcerting to me that Representative Metcalf would have such a sway over the Republican majority in the Senate as to have this bill carried. I think it evidences perhaps that there's another force in the executive branch behind this administration, behind this thrust. But I think if any of us are fiscally conservative, I think we'd have to look really, really hard at what we just saw go down in the Senate, because we don't have the money to pay for something we don't need. And this is a bill that requires us to pay for something that we don't need. It's going to cost about $5 million to do this. There's about $4 million in so-called one-time money coming from the federal government to allow for education and outreach. $1 million from state taxpayer dollars that must reimburse PennDOT for providing free ID. But there's also $2.24 million every year for PennDOT to continue to renew and to provide those IDs. I don't know. I just came through 3 weeks of appropriations with my appropriations leader here, Senator Hughes. I didn't hear that there was any money laying around, Senator. So I think that this is bad public policy that costs the Pennsylvania taxpayers when we don't have the money to pay for it. As Senator Wozniak said, we're spending money we don't have for things we don't need. Thank you.
I never thought this bill would get as far as it did today, and I'm profoundly disappointed with the result of this vote. You know, we lost the vote today, of course, but the real losers are the people of Pennsylvania. The practical impact of this is that people are going to be aggravated, they're going to come to the polls and be discouraged, and they won't come back. We already know that in some elections, we have turnouts in the teens, in the 20%. Imagine how discouraging this will be when you come to a poll, are told that you cannot vote, or you can vote on a provisional ballot. I've seen that process. It's not encouraging. It's not one that you can have much confidence in. However, it's the process that we have right now. I look forward to seeing how we can work together to upend this legislation. It's the wrong thing to do for Pennsylvania. Thank you.
One other group that we haven't mentioned to date is those many hundreds of poll workers, the folks that work behind the table that are registering folks in to vote, and how this bill is going to possibly criminalize them if they accidentally forget to ask someone for an ID, or have a friend of theirs who has voted at that precinct for many, many years, and there's a poll watcher maybe from the other side that doesn't see them actually ask for that ID to see if that's really the person who it is. They have an opportunity to become a criminal because of the fact that they didn't ask for that. So here's someone who's basically working for next to nothing, working for the process that they feel very important about, the election process, that could end up becoming a criminal by the mere fact that they didn't follow to the rules of this bill. So as you've heard from many of the folks already, and there's still a couple more to bring forward, we have done a terrible, terrible injustice to the voters of Pennsylvania, and we will all be working very strongly to get that turned around.
I look at things from a basic, realistic point of view. I received, and I know this legislature received, thousands of emails from our constituents asking us to vote no. I think myself, I got maybe 2 yeses to vote yes. So what's that about? I mean, obviously the folks out there that are affected by this believe it's going to decrease voter participation. And the question is, why? Why does the group on the other side of the aisle want to decrease voter participation? And on top of the redistricting fiasco that's just going on, or is going on. It's politics, plain and simple politics. That's what we're doing here. We spent all this time, all this effort about their politics. This is about disenfranchising voters, our voters, at least in their mind, and that's why they're doing what they're doing. It's as simple as that.
Thank you, Senator. Today is a sad day in the Commonwealth. The governor is suppressing voters. I have senior citizens calling my office, hundreds of them. They are afraid. They don't want to vote by a provisional ballot. They want to go in and they want to vote themselves. They don't have the ID right now. The governor is also restricting handicapped folks from voting. I don't know. Today he even barricaded the elevators again because there was a group of folks in wheelchairs. I see how that's going, and you know what? We're not second-rate citizens. You know, we deserve what everybody else deserves in this Commonwealth.
Okay, so you heard from our collective members of Democratic members who fought for 4.5 hours to try to put on, to make a bad bill better. But at the end of the day, we exhibited our passion on the floor and here today, this evening. At this point, we'll be happy to entertain any questions that folks may have about anything we discussed or any other information about what we discussed on the Senate floor. Yes. Well, I think I'll ask Senator Williams to answer that, but there are a number of grounds, particularly as it relates to what some other states are doing. But it's the suppression of voters is really the central thrust of that. But Senator Williams can discuss those issues, those elements that we discussed earlier.
There are a number of equal protection issues. They created a separate class when they decided that long-term care facilities were allowed to have a certain type of identification. Students that are within Pennsylvania that, in fact, they admitted if you're a student who comes from a different state, but you now get a driver's license in Pennsylvania, you automatically get registered to vote. That person now has the opportunity to vote in 2 different places. In fact, may happen simply because they're a student, they don't realize what they're doing. That fraud, they have now created that, but they've created another class because they're discriminating against Pennsylvania students who go to college here versus those Pennsylvania students who choose to go other places. And so those 2 classes clearly are defined by their own admission. There are others, ethnic groups, gender groups, and age populations, which all too will be affected based upon the fact that they may have to go out and purchase additional items, incur costs to get that information, as was effectively articulated by Senator Kitchen. If you live in a rural part of Pennsylvania, you have to pay costs to get to that place, $30, $20, whatever it is with the cost of gas. Then you are in fact incurring a cost for the privilege of voting. So on the areas of equal protection, that will probably be the strongest element of the lawsuit.
If I can just amplify, I agree. Senator Williams is absolutely correct. There's equal protection grounds. Anytime that you have a law that treats different classes of people differently, there's going to be, there has to be a justification for that law. Most laws, it's what's called a rational basis test. It's a very low threshold as long as there's a rational reason for the law. However, in 2 cases, it's a heightened test. If there's what they call a suspect class, and here African Americans, people of different ethnicities are treated, the impact on them is greater than it is back on the other groups, and so there's a suspect class right there. Plus, there's if there's a fundamental right impacted. Here, there's a fundamental right impacted, which is the right to vote. Finally, there's also another cause of action, which involves what the Wisconsin court talked about in terms of the poll tax. There is specific constitutional language prohibiting poll taxes. There's a substantive due process claim on that as well. And there may be other claims, which we haven't done the research fully yet, under the Voting Rights Act and under the Civil Rights Act. So there's constitutional and federal statutory claims, as well as potentially under the state constitution and statutes as well.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you all very much for coming by this evening, and thank you for covering this press event.